The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Long ago, Gichigumi had created a beautiful world where the people could gather berries and find animals and till the soil and grow food that they needed. It was bountiful and it was beautiful. But he wanted to send one of his helpers to check and see how everybody was doing, how the people were doing on the earth. So he sent Manabozo down, and Manabozo came and looked at the beautiful vistas, the trees and the mountains and the valleys and the rivers, and he too was taken by the beauty of the place. But when he went to the village of the people that he was coming to see, there was nobody there. Their dwellings were empty. The place was quiet. Where could everybody have gone? So he started walking through the woods, and he didn't see anybody hoeing and didn't hear anybody out, the women gathering, chattering as they would be gathering the berries. It was quiet. Not the right kind of quiet, though. As he made his way into this beautiful grove of maple trees, he looked down, and there all the people were. They were lying on the ground. Because in those days, one of the gifts that had been given to the people was the gift of maple sap. All you had to do was break a twig off the tree, and the maple sap would start flowing. The people knew that. So they had broken off the twigs, and they were laying on the ground, just taking in all that maple sap. Oh, it was so good and so sweet and so delicious. There was no need to move. There was no need to get up and do anything. There was no need to tend the children or sit and sew the beautiful moccasins or repair the wigwams that might need fixing. They were there just taking in the maple sap. Manabozo knew this was wrong. This isn't right. People need to work, and they need to care for each other, and they need to talk to each other, and they need to build community. And so he went back to the village, and there gathered some of the beautiful birch bark baskets that had been made that hadn't rotted out yet, and took them to the river. And basket after basketful, he poured onto all those trees more and more water, thinning out the maple syrup, creating a maple sap that now flowed easier and more quickly, but didn't have the sweetness to it, didn't have the thickness, so that if people could still have the maple syrup, but now they would have to gather it in baskets and bring it and put it in other baskets and heat up stones, gather the wood, bring the wood in, heat up stones, and put the stones in the maple sap until it boiled and boiled and boiled, and the sap evaporated. And after much working, and this wasn't something you could do by yourself, everyone had to join in together. Everyone had to bring the wood. Everyone had to bring the stones to be heated. Everybody had to gather the sap, and they had to work together as community and take care of each other while the sap boiled away, and then eventually left them with that sweet tasting maple syrup that now they valued in a different way because they had earned it, and they had worked together, and they had stories to tell about, oh, last year when we made the sap, do you remember how this happened or that happened? And that's the story how we came from having maple syrup coming out of our maple trees to it being the maple sap that we have to work a little harder for.
So, on the island of Borin came, among the Taino people, in their language, Taino meant the good ones. There was an especially good man. His name was Milomaki. And he was tall, and probably you would say he was handsome, and he was brave, but he was also very well loved by the people. Not just because of his bravery or his height or his handsomeness, but because he had an especially beautiful singing voice. If you were sick and you heard Milomaki sing, you would feel well. If you were sad and you heard him sing, you would be happy. And people from all over the island began to come and try to hear Milomaki sing, either for healing or just for joy. And at that time, the gods who were watching over the island and keeping things in order felt that this was not what should be happening, that people were giving too much love and adoration to Milomaki. And they began to watch and wait and see how he might come to his downfall. Well, one day, Milomaki was heading out toward the beach, and the fishermen were coming up from the beach, and they had been in the sun all morning. They had heavy loads of fish on their backs, and they were sweaty and hot, and they said, Milomaki, sing us a song and make us feel better. We're so tired. So Milomaki turned and went back into the rainforest a bit, and they came to a clearing, and it was a little cooler away from the beach, and he sang them a song of cool, refreshing breezes. And the men began to feel refreshed, and they began to stand up taller. And then Milomaki's song changed to a song about warriors brave in battle. And the fishermen, now standing up straight and tall and refreshed and feeling strong, put their fish down and began to do a dance of triumph as if they were warriors. And they danced and sang for a long time until the sun began to go down over the trees. And Milomaki stopped singing, and they came back to themselves, and there were their fish, and they said, oh, our village is waiting for our fish. We have to go. And so they thanked Milomaki, and they picked up their fish, and they went back to the village. And the women who had been gathering herbs and roots cooked the fish, and everyone in the village, they shared the fish with everyone. Everyone in the village had a wonderful meal. But that night, as people slept, they began to feel ill. People began to have cramps and aching in their bellies. They began to have headaches. They began to feel very sick. And the fishermen woke, and they were sickest of all, and they said, this is the fault of Milomaki. Milomaki made us think that we were warriors brave in battle. We forgot that we were fishermen. We forgot what we know. We left our fish in the sun. We forgot that fish must be brought home as quickly as possible from the water, and while they are still close to life and fresh, they must be cooked and eaten. This is the fault of Milomaki. And they were sick, they were weak from being ill, they were angry, and this is the moment that the gods who watched over the island were waiting for. And so they stirred in that anger until it became like flames of rage. And the men were blind with their rage, and they said, we must find Milomaki and punish him for what he has done. And they went out in the darkness into the rainforest. They stumbled, they looked, they searched, and it was almost morning when they found Milomaki still sleeping. And when they laid hands on him and he woke, he didn't struggle because he looked into the faces of these men. He knew who they were. He didn't wish them any harm. He was confused. But the gods had stirred in the anger of these men until they said, "We will make Milomaki feel the anger and the rage that we feel. We will build a fire around him." And they took Milomaki and they found dry sticks and a great dry log. And they took him out onto the beach and they bound him with vines and they started the fire at his feet around his body. Now Milomaki knew that the life he had always lived was coming to an end. And he began to sing. He began to sing from the depths of himself. He began to sing of water and rain and wetness. And as he sang, water began to come over the island. And it came first into the rainforest and it dripped down through the top canopy of the trees and then rolled down along the vines and the trunks and soaked into the soil. But it also began to fall in that fire. And it began to fall on the men who were raging around Milomaki, and the rain cooled that anger, and suddenly the blind rage was swept away from their eyes, and they saw what they were doing to the great singer. "Milomaki, no," they said. But it was too late. The great singer was swept up in the flames. Steam rose from the water. And the Taino people say that the first of the greatest of the palm trees rose up in that spot where Milomaki, the great singer, had come to the end of his life here on earth. And that the royal palm, taller than all the other palms, came from the spirit of the great singer. And whenever the people stood under the royal palm, they could hear those breezes blowing through the palm tree, and they could hear and remember the voice of Milomaki. And so now, when we stand under the palms, we can listen to the sound that comes through the palm fronds. And if we are sick, we will feel well. And if we are sad, we can feel happy. And remember the great singer who gave his life and started the royal palms.
Well, you know that every place you go, cities are known for certain things. Like New York City, the Big Apple is known for the Empire State Building and Central Park. San Francisco is known for its trolleys and its views of San Francisco Bay. Albany is known because the legislature's there, and we now know it and recognize it as a place where Alexander Hamilton spent a lot of time. So that makes Albany special. But this story takes place in a city a kingdom actually, where it was known for its noise. It was the city and kingdom of hubbub. Yes, the kingdom of hubbub. And it was ruled by a king, and every place in hubbub, the doors were the slammiest, the cars were the honkiest, the pots and pans were the bangiest, the voices were the loudest, the doors were the slammiest. And the king's youngest son loved with his friends banging their pots and making as much noise as they could, because that was the challenge of living in hubbub. What else can you add to the noise of hubbub every day? Well, as it turns out, Prince Hullabaloo was his name, was about to celebrate his 6th birthday. And the king was trying to figure out what to get him for his birthday. And he would ask his son, well, do you want a new set of marbles? No, didn't want marbles. How about a new... And he went through a list after list. He even offered to get his son a horse, a pony. But that was not what the prince wanted. So the prince, too, was thinking about what he wanted. And one day, as he was playing with his friends, he realized, "I've got it!" he shouted, because you're in hubbub and you've got to shout. "I want to make, on my birthday, the loudest noise in the world." And he went to his father and he told him, Father, I know what I want to do. I want to have the loudest noise in the world." Well, what would that mean? Well, the king and his counselors got together and they talked and they yelled and they shouted and they thought as best you could with all that hubbub going on. And they decided to send out notices far and wide that on the prince's birthday at 12 o'clock noon, everybody would join together and they would bang their bangiest pots and pans, and the car horns would beep, and the people would shout as loud as they could. And make as much noise as they would, and they sent out messengers far and wide. And as the day approached, people were talking and planning and figuring out what they were going to do to make the prince's birthday the happiest birthday he could possibly have. So the day drew near, and the prince was set to be out on the balcony of the castle. And the people gathered in the town square. Hundreds and hundreds of people gathered and coming to celebrate and make the noise. But one of the men in the town had said to his buddy, "I'm not really going to make any noise." "Well, how can you not make noise? The prince will be sad if you don't." "I want to hear what it sounds like," said the man. And the man went off with that information and told his wife. Well, you never know what happens when people get an idea and it starts to spread. But that day they arrived in the town square, and the prince was up on the balcony of the beautiful castle. And as they looked up, they could see the prince, and they could see the king standing nearby, and all his counselors. And there was the beautiful castle, and behind the castle was this beautiful woods, this beautiful forest. It was a wonderful setting for the prince to have to celebrate his birthday. So the prince went out, and the people were cheering and waving, and he waved. And the hands on the clock got closer and closer and closer and closer. And just as it got to be 12 o'clock, everybody was set for the loudest screaming, the bangiest bangest, the slammiest doors, the cars honking. And as it got there closer, all of a sudden the whole city of hubbub went quiet. Everybody had stopped. They too wanted to hear what it was going to sound like to have the noisiest sound in the whole world. And as they stopped breathing. And from those woods behind the castle, you could hear dee-dee-dee-dee. Well, the prince's ears perked up, and a big smile came across his face. He had never heard a bird in the quiet making its song. Now, the birds don't make their songs for us, we know that, but we do enjoy it, and we do hear it kind of as the music in the world. And you could see the people down in the courtyard. At first they were afraid because they didn't want the prince to burst into tears and cry because he didn't get the noisiest noise in the world. He got silence with just the sound of the world. And they all stood there and listened. And they could hear the wind coming through the trees. And the people in the court down in the village square turned to each other. And they smiled, and they nodded, and they hugged one another. And they whispered in soft whispers and quiet voices. "Isn't this wonderful? Can you believe it? The prince is happy. We're hearing the birds." And they all quietly went arm in arm, quietly, softly padding to their house. Not a car horn was sound, not a bang was crashed. And when they closed the doors, the slamiest doors were closed quietly in the door frames, so that at the end you could even hear the latch click. And from then on, the city of Hubbub was known for being a soft-spoken, quiet place where people could hear the birds and they could hear one another and listen and be happy in the city of Hubbub. Or something like that.
The people had come up from under the underworld. It was still the time of ancient things. But they had divided into clans and decided to make villages. And it was at this time that Gokeng Sowuti, Spider Grandmother, left the people. And she took with her just her 2 boy grandchildren, Palangahoya and Pakonghoya. And she went to live high on the edge of the Black Mesa. Now, these 2 boys were twins, and what one did, the other did also. And at first, life was wonderful for them in this new place. They could explore in any direction they wanted to. They played stickball as they explored. They caught rabbits and brought them back to Spider Grandmother to cook. And they loved not having to share Spider Grandmother's attention with anyone else. But eventually, they began to miss their playmates. They began to miss other human beings. And they said, "Grandmother, where can we find some people to play with?" And she said, "Oh, we are the only people. We are the only human people here on the Black Mesa." Well, the boys didn't like that answer very much. And they talked together and they said, "Spider Grandmother is old. She surely has not explored everything. She must not know. There have to be people here somewhere." And so they went to the west. No people. They got up earlier. They went to the north. No people. Every time they went out, they could only go as far until the sun was high over their heads, because they knew that it would take them the time from the sun to go down to get back home to Spider Grandmother. They began to wake earlier and earlier. On the time that they went to the east, they woke long before the sun would come into their eyes. And they went as far as they could that day until the sun was over their heads, but still there were no people. Finally, they went to the south. And they started so early, they were in the darkness when they started, and they decided to play stickball as they ran so that they wouldn't be thinking about their legs being tired. They would just be running and chasing that stickball, and they went farther and farther to the south. They climbed up over a huge ridge, and when they looked down, they saw something that they'd never seen before. They saw water bubbling up out of the ground. And they saw around that water, there were tall, slender plants. We would call them reeds. They had never seen these plants in the dry place that they had lived before or any place else on the Black Mesa. They went down toward that place. And as they got closer to where the water was bubbling up out of the ground, they noticed that their feet were sinking into the earth. It was soft. They took off their moccasins, and the closer they got to that water, the more their feet sank into the earth, and for the first time, they saw their footprints in that soft, muddy soil. And before they knew it, without talking, without planning, they were sitting down in that mud, and they were taking that mud into their hands, and they were making people. Little men and women and boys and girls, and then they had so many people made out of mud that they began to make a village that looked like the village they remembered, where they had lived before they came to the Black Mesa with Spider Grandmother. They made places, and they built houses that were square and flat. They made a kiva for the men to go down under the ground. They made women grinding corn and boys and girls wrestling to be strong. They made men weaving cloth. But then they noticed that the sun was much more than over their heads. It was beginning to go down. And by the time they got back to Spider Grandmother, it was dark. And Spider Grandmother was a darker darkness against the night, standing outlined. And she said, "Where have you been? I have been waiting for you so long." And they said, "Oh, Grandmother, you know we've been looking for people. And we've gone all the directions, but today we went to the south." "And did you find people?" she said. "No, Grandmother, we didn't find any people, but we came to this place where the water bubbled up out of the earth, and Grandmother, the earth there stuck together. We started making people, and we made a village just like the one we remembered that we came from. And Grandmother, we weren't lonely all day long today, and tomorrow we're going back there." "No," she said, "not tomorrow. Wait 4 days. Wait for your village to dry. Wait 4 days, and then you may go back to your village." Well, you know how sometimes 4 days pass and we don't even notice. But when you're waiting for 4 days, for something like your birthday or something you really want to, a trip you want to leave on, which is the case with the boys, the time seemed so long and heavy, and they began to quarrel with each other. But finally, on the 4th morning, they rose in the darkness. They came to the place where they had climbed up, and as they were climbing up, Palangahoya said, "I hear something." And Pakangahoya said, I do too. It sounds like people's voices." And when they got to the top and looked down, they saw that that little mud village they had made was now a great, regular-size village. And Pakangahoya said, look at that woman grinding corn. I remember shaping her. Look at that man on the roof. He's the watchman. I put him there." And they looked at each other and they said, "This must be what Spider Grandmother meant by drying." And they ran down toward that village. And the man who was on the roof saw them coming, and he called out, "Kiava Kovi," which means someone is coming in the Hopi language. And when Palanghoya and Bakanghoya arrived at that village, every family from every house was waiting. And every family invited them in and gave them melon and corn and peaky bread made of that blue corn. And at the end of the day, one of the men of the village took them down into the kiva as if they were no longer boys. When they were ready to leave the village, the light was leaving the earth. And their arms were full of peaky bread, and they went as fast as they could back to Spider Grandmother, but again, she was a dark silhouette against the sky. And she said, "It is so late. I was so worried. Where have you been?" They said, "Grandmother, don't you remember? This is the day when we could go back to our village. Oh, she said, yes, your village. Was it dry? Oh, yes, grandmother. They said it was truly dry. And were there people, she said. Oh, yes, grandmother. There were so many people. Look, they gave us all this peaky bread to bring back to you. And Spider Grandmother said, yes, because you created these people out of mud and loneliness, they will be as if they are your children. That is how we are all created. And you must treat them well forever. And so it is said that the village of Lameva, where that spring is, and the people of the Reed clan were created out of mud and loneliness by Palangahoya and Pakonghoya and brought to life by Spider Grandmother.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.